16.1 times EBITDA, the highest multiple ever paid for a paint company anywhere on earth. $4.2 billion handed over in cash on the 21st of August 2019 by a Tokyo paint giant controlled by a Singapore family for an Australian brand most people in this country first held in their hands as children. The yellow cartridge, the orange nozzle, the acetic acid smell when the foil seal breaks. Selleys, in the bathroom, in the kitchen, in the shed. For 80 years. And here's the part that nobody told the country. The man who started the company landed in Melbourne with 10 Reichsmarks in his pocket, 3 weeks before war was declared, on the run from Nazi Germany. He sold it in 1963 for a price he never disclosed. How does 10 Reichsmarks become $4 billion in 80 years and end up belonging to a family in Singapore? Before we go any further, hit like and subscribe. Every subscriber keeps these stories alive. Chapter 1. 10 Reichsmarks and a putty recipe. He was born Martin Israel Sally, not Selly, on the 15th of March 1897 in Sprotau, Lower Silesia, a town that exists today only as Sprotawa in Poland. His father Isidor was a Berlin putty manufacturer. His mother, Regina née Goldstaub, raised a Jewish family in a Germany that in those years still pretended it had room for them. Here's the thing about Martin Sally. He fought for that country. He served as a non-commissioned officer in the Imperial German Army through the First World War, 4 years in the trenches, decorated for bravery, per the entry that would later appear under his name in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. The same country that decorated him would, 20 years later, send men to his door with lists. Read that again. He was decorated by Germany, then hunted by Germany. The same uniform, the same flag. In May 1931 in Berlin, he married Erna Sarah Christella. They had one son. By the late 1930s, Kristallnacht, the racial laws, the forced Aryanization of Jewish businesses, the putty workshop his father had built was no longer his. The family was no longer safe. They needed out. In London, the German Jewish Aid Committee, operating out of Bloomsbury House, agreed to lend him £200. He had 3 days. His transit visa was expiring. He boarded the Strathnava, a P&O liner sailing for Australia, with 10 Reichsmarks in his pocket. Let that number sit for a moment. 10 Reichsmarks. In 1939, 10 Reichsmarks bought you maybe 2 loaves of bread. That was the founding capital of what would become Australia's biggest adhesive empire, measured in bread. He arrived in Melbourne on the 8th of August 1939. 27 days later, on the 3rd of September, Britain declared war on Germany. Australia followed within hours. The country he had just escaped was now the country his new country is at war with. The accent on his name was a problem. The passport in his drawer was an enemy document. The £200 was already half spent. He had 3 weeks. 3 weeks to find a way to make putty before the country he had just arrived in was at war with the country he had just escaped. And here is the contradiction the official biography does not dwell on. In 1963, 24 years after he arrived with bread money in his pocket, 24 years after the country that took him in let him build something that would outlast him, Martin Selleys sold the company to a British firm called British Paints Australia Proprietary Limited. He was 66 years old. The sale price was never made public, not to the press, not to the workforce in Marrickville, not in any document the Australian Dictionary of Biography was able to obtain. He retired to a Mosman home overlooking Middle Harbour. He gave generously to the Montefiore Jewish home at Hunters Hill. He kept the cheque private. The workers who had built the 18 products with him, who had stood at the bench through the linseed oil rationing years, the post-war boom, the Marrickville expansion, never learned what their working life had been bought and sold for. They learned only that, one Monday morning in 1963, the company that paid them belonged to somebody else. That silence is where the rest of the story starts. Chapter 2. The Surry Hills Terrace. He rented a terrace in Surry Hills, not a factory, a terrace, the narrow two-storey Sydney workman's house with a tiny yard and a back lane. He partnered with a man named Max Wolfe for 3.5 years, 2 refugees and a tin of putty. That was the start. The country he had landed in was by 1940 running out of things. Aluminium imports for civilian kitchen utensils had been redirected to aircraft. Pots and pans were cracking. Women across Australia were trying to repair them with whatever was available, which was nothing, because nothing was available. Martin Selleys sits at his bench in Surry Hills. The terrace smells of resin and turpentine. He grinds the powder. He weighs the binder. He tests a small batch on a fragment of cast aluminium pulled from a broken kettle. He cures it. He breaks it apart. He weighs the result. He starts again. He knows putty. His father taught him in Berlin. He knows chemistry, the technical school training he carried out of Germany in a cardboard suitcase. He invents a metallic cement that bonds aluminium to aluminium, cast iron to cast iron, anything to anything in the kitchen, on the stove, in the washhouse. He calls it Selleys metallic cement. And here's the kicker. The federal government in Canberra had instituted linseed oil quotas. Linseed oil was a war commodity, used in paint, used in munitions, in short supply for civilian putty manufacturers. Martin Selleys sits at the same bench and redesigns the formula. His substitute putty uses resins and other oils, reduces linseed content by a full third, and according to the trade record of the period, does not compromise quality. Read that again. A man who had been in Australia for less than 12 months redesigned the country's putty so the country could keep its windows in. From 1940 onwards, he developed 18 products: metallic cement, instant grip, plastic wood, Unifix, waterproof glue. The list reads like a tradesman's mental inventory, exactly the things you don't think about until the moment you need them. And then you cannot do the job without them. 18 products. From a Surry Hills terrace. From 10 Reichsmarks. By 1944, the business was trading formally as Selleys Chemical Manufacturing Company Proprietary Limited. In 1945, the year the war ended, he was naturalised as an Australian citizen, and the family name was legally changed by deed poll. Sally became Selly. The pronunciation the locals had been using for 6 years became the spelling on the certificate. By 1948, he had outgrown Surry Hills. He opened in Marrickville, then in Melbourne. Then he did something only a refugee would think of. He turned his glue into a brand. Chapter 3. The Handyman Bar. The post-war boom in Australia was a building boom, 90,000 new homes a year by the mid-1950s. Holden was rolling cars out of Fisherman's Bend. The western suburbs of Sydney and the eastern suburbs of Melbourne were sprawling out into paddocks that had been farmland 12 months earlier. The country was inventing in real time something it had not had before, a suburban DIY identity. The Saturday morning at the hardware store, the Hills hoist in the backyard, the man in the shed with the radio on. And here's the thing about that man in the shed. He needed glue. He needed silicone. He needed putty for the window the kids had cricket balled. He needed something that would seal the bathroom before the wife noticed the mould. He needed it on a Saturday morning at the local hardware store, not from a tradesman, not from a chemist's shop, but from a shelf he could reach himself. In 1959, Selleys did something nobody else in the Australian adhesive trade had done. The company launched the Selleys Handyman Bar, a curated point-of-sale rack of products that hardware stores could install in a corner of the shop. Plastic wood for the broken chair leg, Aquadeer for the kids' school project, metallic cement for the pot, instant grip for everything else. It was the first time an Australian adhesive brand sold not to plumbers and not to builders, but directly to the homeowner, the man with the shed. That same year, the tagline that would survive everything else was minted. 5 words. If it's Selleys, it works. Read it again. There is no boast in it, no exaggeration, no empire, just a flat, working-class promise. If it's ours, it works. If it isn't, that's not our problem. It is the voice of a man who has been at the bench for 20 years and is tired of explaining why. And the country bought it. By the late 1950s, the Royal Australian Navy was using Selleys caulking compound on the 250-ton crane at Garden Island in Sydney Harbour, a crane completed in 1951. And the Australian Dictionary of Biography notes the Selleys product was used because it was superior to the imported American product, a refugee's caulk beating Connecticut, on a naval base, in a country that, 15 years earlier, had treated his passport as an enemy document. But by 1963, the man who had built all of this from 10 Reichsmarks was 66 years old. He took the cheque from British Paints. He moved to Mossman. He never told a journalist what the cheque said. And the empire he built, the cartridge in every shed, began its 63-year journey through 6 foreign owners. Chapter 4. The Yellow Cartridge. Walk into any Australian shed today. Look on the workbench. Look in the bottom drawer of the toolbox. Look in the milk crate under the trestle. You will find one. The yellow cartridge with the orange nozzle, Selleys No More Gaps, the screw-on tip. The smell when you cut the seal, that thin, sharp acetic acid hit, that means a job is about to be done. You have used one. Your father used one. The plumber you called last week used one. By the 1970s and the 1980s, the Selleys catalogue had grown into a small empire of yellow tubes and white tubs. No more gaps for the bathroom skirting and the kitchen splashback. Liquid nails for the architrave the carpenter forgot to glue. Spack filler for the plasterboard hole behind the door handle. All clear for the silicone that had to be invisible. Need it for the leaking pipe at 5 o'clock on a Sunday. Aquadeer, the yellow and red tin in every Australian primary school classroom from the 1970s onward. The smell of white PVA on butcher's paper. The kids' fingers stuck together. Wet area for the shower. Regrout that needed to last 10 years. Each one a problem. Each one a product. Each one in a yellow package on the same hardware store shelf. By this point, the company had moved its main manufacturing operation from Marrickville to a 6-hectare site at Padstow on Gow Street in Sydney's southwestern industrial belt, between the M5 motorway, the Bankstown Airport flight path, and the freight rail corridor that fed Port Botany. The exact year of the Padstow move is not in the public record. A Selleys product tin in the museum's Victoria collection carries a Bankstown LGA address by the 1970s or the 1980s. That is the best the archive offers. 6 hectares. A tanker yard, a warehouse, a laboratory, a production hall. And on the lines, through the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, the people running them were not the people the marketing materials photographed. They were the migrant families of Sydney's southwest, the Lebanese families of Lakemba and Punchbowl, the Vietnamese families of Bankstown, the Greek families who had come in the 1960s, the Macedonian families, the Italian families, the Chinese families who came in the 1990s. They worked the silicone line, the cartridge fill, the dispatch bay, the tanker bay, the quality lab. They worked the day shift and the afternoon shift. They drove home in their utes, 4 kilometres, 8 kilometres, 12 kilometres, to weatherboards and brick veneers in the suburbs that, by the 2021 census, would record 65.9% of residents speaking a language other than English at home. No Selleys publication has ever named them. No annual report has ever published a peak workforce figure. They do not exist in the official archive. But they made the cartridges that made the empire. And in 1989, 8 years into this period, a graduate chemist arrives at the conglomerate that owns the brand. His name is Patrick Houlihan. He is 21 years old. Per his Emmanuel College Warrnambool alumni profile, he grew up on a dairy farm at Winslow in Western Victoria, was Dux of Science at St Joseph's CBC Warrnambool in 1984, and holds a Bachelor of Science with honours from the University of Melbourne. He has just been offered a graduate chemist position at ICI Dulux, the conglomerate that now owns Selleys. That same year, 1989, Martin Israel Selly dies in St Leonards, aged 92. The man who arrived with 10 Reichsmarks and the man who will one day sell the company for $4 billion never meet. But under foreign ownership, the catalogue will keep growing for another 40 years, until one Wednesday in April 2019, a Japanese paint giant offers $4 billion. Chapter 5. The Cost of the Empire. Here's what nobody put on the cartridge. 40 years of chemical manufacturing leave a record the marketing department cannot rewrite. Solvents, resins, acetic acid, polyurethane catalysts. The smell that made the silicone work was the smell that, over decades, went into the soil under the production hall, into the groundwater under the tanker yard, into the air the workers breathed during their Friday afternoon shift. On the 28th of October 2024, an environmental consultancy called Senversa delivered a remediation action plan for the Padstow site. The document is not light reading. It confirms historic contamination, chemical discharges accumulated across decades of manufacturing that has to be cleaned before the next factory can be built on top of it. The empire was built on ground that has to be cleaned before the next empire can be built. And the workers who breathed that air, who were they? Padstow sits in the city of Canterbury Bankstown, which the council itself describes as one of the most culturally, socially and economically diverse communities in Sydney, over 129 nationalities and around 200 languages. The 2021 census confirms that 65.9% of residents speak a language other than English at home. The top languages, after English, are Arabic at 17.2%, Vietnamese at 7.2%, Greek at 5.4%, Mandarin at 5%. These are not abstractions. They are the families on the silicone line, the families in the dispatch bay, the families on the cartridge fill, the Curies and the Nguyen's and the Papadopouloses and the Chans, the fathers and the sons and the daughters and the grandsons. The lunchboxes packed at 4 in the morning. The shifts that started at 6, the drive home along Canterbury Road in the dark. No Selleys publication has ever enumerated them by name. No annual report has ever published a peak workforce figure. They do not exist in the official archive. But the soil knows they were there, and this is where it gets genuinely insane. The 18 products that Martin Selly developed from 1940 onwards were not just 18 good ideas. They were 18 hazardous chemical formulations. The man who designed them died at 92 in 1989. Full Life, Mosman Home, Montefiore Jewish Home as a benefactor, Jewish section of Northern Suburbs Cemetery. The workers who ran his formulations through the production line for the next 4 decades. What age did they die at? The Selleys archive does not say. By the late 1980s, Australia was about to have a conversation about who owned its factories. Hawke had been elected in 1983. Keating was Treasurer. Industry Minister John Button was drafting the plan that would phase out the tariffs that had protected Australian manufacturing for 70 years. Foreign capital was about to flood in. and Selleys, by 1988, was already on the list. Chapter 6. The country that cracked itself open. But here's the problem. Before Hawke, before Keating, before Button, before any of that, one man had already cracked the country open. 18 July 1973. 7 o'clock in the evening. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam appears on national television and announces an across-the-board tariff cut of 25%, effective midnight. The decision had been drafted in secret over 3 weeks by a committee of 6 men, chaired by Alf Rattigan, the head of the Tariff Board. Cabinet had not been consulted in any detail. The industries affected had not been warned. Chemical sector tariffs at the time ran among the highest in the industrial economy. The wall that protected Selleys from European, American and Japanese adhesive imports was cut by a quarter overnight. Alex Milmau, writing in The Conversation on the 50th anniversary, summarised the consequence. Quote, "Over the next 7 years, manufacturing employment fell by 80,000. Read that again. 80,000 jobs, 7 years. One Tuesday evening announcement. Selleys survived. Heavy, low-density Einmachen, high-margin corks and adhesives carry a freight and shelf-life economics that protects local manufacturing even at zero tariff. A tube of silicone is mostly air and water. You cannot ship it from Rotterdam cheaper than you can make it in Padstow. The factory kept running. But the conglomerate above it began to consolidate. In 1988, the British chemical giant ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, acquired Berger and British Paints in Australia. The combined transaction was reported at approximately 130 million Australian dollars, though specific allocation between the two paint businesses has never been publicly confirmed. Selleys, which had been quietly owned through that British paint structure since 1963, was folded into the Dulux division of ICI Australia. The 1963 sale price, the figure Martin Selleys accepted from British Paints at age 66, has never been made public. We do not know what he was paid. The cartridge on the shelf in 1988 said Selleys. The owner had been British, then German via Hoechst, then British again via ICI. In 1997, ICI plc in London decided to divest its Australian operation. ICI Australia was renamed Orica Limited and listed on the ASX. In 1998, Orica formally took ownership of Selleys. Patrick Houlihan, by now 7 years into ICI Dulux, was sent in 1992 to a secondment at the ICI head office in Cleveland, Ohio. Per his Emmanuel College alumni profile, he met his wife Susan in America during that period. He returned to Australia in 1993 with an MBA at Mount Eliza ahead of him, and a clear understanding that the company that paid him was no longer Australian in the way his father's farm at Winslow was Australian. And on 19 July 2010, Orica did what every conglomerate eventually does. It cut Selleys loose. Chapter 7. The Demerger and the Decade That Followed. 19th of July 2010. Orica demerges its consumer paint and coatings division. The new entity is called DuluxGroup Limited. It carries Dulux Paint, Cabot Stains, Yates Garden Products, British Paints and Selleys. 1 DLX share is issued for every Orica share held. The new ticker is DLX. The new chief executive is Patrick Houlihan, by now 42 years old, 21 years into a single corporate ladder. For 9 years, the cartridge in the shed and the share price on the ASX seemed to confirm something that was almost true. Selleys was Australian. DuluxGroup was Australian. The ticker was Sydney. The head office was Melbourne. The factory was Padstow. The man running the company had grown up on a dairy farm in Winslow. DuluxGroup's revenue grew from $910 million in financial year 2010 to $1.8 billion in financial year 2018. EBITDA reached $257.7 million. The dividend yield ran 4 to 5%. 3 R&D hubs operated globally: Padstow in New South Wales, Clayton in Victoria, Chromology in France. Selleys and Yates shared the Padstow Innovation Centre. The brand was profitable. The brand was Australian listed. The brand was on the shelf at Bunnings and Mitre 10 every Saturday morning of every Australian's adult life. But here's the kicker. In January 2016, DuluxGroup quietly eliminated approximately 80 jobs across 2 Sydney distribution centres, the Padstow distribution operation and the Moorebank distribution operation, outsourcing the work to the logistics company Linfox. The workforce was covered by United Voice, now the United Workers' Union. The union organiser who fronted the press at this time was a man named Damien Davey. His quote, as reported at the time, was 9 words long. Average service here is more than 20 years. 20 years. The man who had packed Selleys cartridges into pallets for 2 decades was being made redundant, so a Linfox driver could do it instead. At the same time, in Brisbane, the workers at the Dulux Rockley paint plant went on strike for 9 days over redundancy provisions. The press coverage was modest. The country, on the whole, did not notice. But on the floor of the Padstow factory, across the road from the distribution centre, the message was understood. The lines kept running. The cartridges kept coming off. The men and women on the floor watched their colleagues at the dispatch bay walk out the Moorebank gate. Average service, more than 20 years. The redundancy provisions, contested. This was 2016. 3 years before Tokyo. 3 years before $4.2 billion. And then in April 2019, the phone rang in Patrick Houlihan's office. The caller was from Tokyo. Chapter 8, 16.1 times, 17 April 2019, 7 o'clock in the morning, Sydney time. DuluxGroup releases a price-sensitive announcement to the Australian Securities Exchange. Nippon Paint Holdings of Tokyo has made a binding offer for 100% of DuluxGroup at $9.80 per share. Let that number sit for a moment. $9.80. The previous day's closing price had been $7.67. The premium was 27.8% to the previous close. The premium was 35.4% to the 3-month volume-weighted average price. Total equity consideration, 3.8 billion Australian dollars. Total enterprise value, including assumed debt, 4.2 billion. In Japanese yen, the currency of the actual cheque, 300.5 billion. And here's the thing, Gilbert and Tobin, the law firm that advised DuluxGroup on the deal, published a press release on its own website in April 2019. The release describes the transaction, in its own verbatim words, as the highest multiple paid in a major paint company transaction globally. Read that again. 16.1 times EBITDA. The highest multiple in global paint M&A history. Not Australian paint M&A. Not Asia-Pacific paint M&A. Global paint M&A. The world record, paid for an Australian company headquartered in a Melbourne suburb in cash by a Tokyo-listed corporation, which is itself controlled by a Singapore family. Because here is the thing about Nippon Paint that the press release does not lead with. The Tokyo headquarters is the surface. The real owner is in Singapore. A holding company called Wuthalam Holdings, controlled by the Go family, with Go Hup-jin as the dominant figure, is the largest shareholder of Nippon Paint Holdings, and Go Hup-jin serves as chairman of Nippon Paint Holdings itself. The brand on every Australian tradesman's cartridge does not belong to Japan in the way the country might assume. It belongs to a Singapore family that controls a Japanese-listed company that owns an Australian brand. The named foreigners arrive in waves. Yuichiro Wakatsuki, co-president of Nippon Paint Holdings, former vice-chairman of investment banking at Merrill Lynch, Japan. Total annual compensation, per public disclosure, approximately 500 million yen, roughly $3.14 million per year. Wee Siew Kim, the Singapore-based co-president, Group CEO of Nipsia, appointed a director of DuluxGroup Limited. Go Hup Jin, chairman of Nippon Paint Holdings, the man who controls it through with alarm, the man no Australian tradesman has ever heard of. On the 31st of July 2019, DuluxGroup shareholders voted. The result? 97.6% in favour. On the 6th of August, the Federal Court of Australia approved the scheme of arrangement. On the 21st of August 2019, Nippon Paint took 100% ownership. DLX delisted from the Australian Securities Exchange. The yellow cartridge on the Bunnings shelf that morning, nothing on the label changed. Selleys. The country went to work. The country went to Bunnings. The country bought the cartridge that, the night before, had changed hands for the highest multiple in the history of the global paint industry. The men and women on the floor at Padstow walked through the gate at 6 in the morning, the same as every other Wednesday. The cartridges came off the line the same as every other Wednesday. The smell of acetic acid filled the production hall the same as every other Wednesday. But here's the thing about a brand that says, Made in Australia on certain product lines on the label. 6 years after Tokyo bought the empire, the soil it was built on had to be cleaned before the country could keep making it. Chapter 9. The soil at 1 Gow Street. The Senversa Remediation Action Plan was delivered on the 28th of October 2024, 85 years after Martin Selleys arrived in Melbourne, 5 years after Tokyo bought the company. 225 pages of soil bore data and groundwater readings on a 6-hectare site between the M5 motorway and Gow Street, the verdict. Decades of solvent, resin, and chemical process discharge. The site requires full remediation before the next phase of manufacturing can begin. On the 15th of November 2024, a planning consultancy called Willow Tree Planning lodged an environmental impact statement for state significant development, application number 7-1052-213. The proposal: demolish the existing warehouse and maintenance building. Remediate the soil per the Senversa plan. Refurbish 8,237 square metres of warehousing for manufacturing. Build a new 8,470 square metre production building. Add 970 square metres of offices. Add 3,270 square metres of laboratories. Total gross floor area, 16,707 square metres. Estimated development cost, more than $30 million. A new Selleys is being built, but built by a Singapore-controlled Japanese-listed subsidiary on land. An Australian refugee bought through his successors decades ago, on soil his successors poisoned, with construction labour added on top of an existing workforce of 357. Here's the thing. The application was assessed across 10 months. Community submissions were lodged. The response to submissions was dated the 28th of May 2025. The historical archaeological assessment was conducted by Biosis as Appendix 25. The cost report was prepared by Linesight as Appendix 20. On the 30th of September 2025, the consent was signed. The signatory was a woman named Joanna Bakopanos. Her title: Acting Director, Industry Assessments, New South Wales Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure. File reference EF247194. Consent lapses 5 years from operational commencement. Operating hours approved. 24 hours, 7 days a week. Joanna Bakopanos signed the document on her keyboard in a state government office in Parramatta. She had never met Martin Selleys. She had no idea she was closing a loop that started in Sprottow, Lower Silesia, in 1897. The refugee bought the land, or his successors did, on the empire he built. The country poisoned the land. The Singapore-controlled Japanese-listed company is rebuilding on the land. The cycle is complete. Chapter 10, 357. The environmental impact statement contains a single sentence that is the most precise workforce data Selleys has produced in 86 years. Quote, approximately 251 direct construction jobs and a total of approximately 357 operational jobs existing for the proposed facility. 357 workers. That is the floor. That is the entire Australian operational workforce of the brand on every shed cartridge. The peak workforce figure, the number at the empire's height in the 1970s or the 1980s, has never been published. Not in annual reports, not in court records, not in parliamentary submissions, not in the Australian Dictionary of Biography. The Selleys archive simply does not say. Compare. The co-president of the company that owns them, Yuichiro Wakatsuki, earns roughly 500 million yen a year per public disclosure, 3.14 million US dollars, roughly 5 million Australian dollars in a single year. One man in one Tokyo office earns in 12 months what a substantial fraction of the Padstow workforce earns collectively. Read that again. Patrick Houlihan, who joined ICI Dulux as a graduate chemist aged 21 in 1989, the year Martin Selleys died at 92 in St Leonards, is now chairman of the same company, reporting upward to Wakatsuki in Tokyo and ultimately to Gohopwo Hoop Jin via Wuthalam in Singapore. He has run the brand for 16 years. He recommended the Nippon scheme to shareholders. They voted 97.6% yes. In 2025, an advertising agency called Howitson and Company ran an outdoor stunt for Selleys across Sydney. A kayak glued to a wall, an arcade machine glued to a wall, a 2.8-metre marlin glued to a wall. The tagline, if you can take it, it's yours. The sign-off, if it's Selleys, it works. 5 words, the same 5 words Martin Selleys minted in 1959. The company doesn't belong to Selleys anymore. The slogan does. The Selleys tradesman in Padstow today, the cartridge still in his ute, the orange nozzle still in the side pocket. He doesn't know who Go Hup Jin is. He doesn't need to. He has a bathroom to seal on Saturday morning. Walk down Gow Street in Padstow today, and you will find an active factory. Walk into any Australian shed, though, and you will find something the founder never sold. Chapter 11. What 10 Reichsmarks built. Stand at the corner of Gow Street and the M5 motorway off-ramp in Padstow today. The chain-link fence runs the length of the block. A tanker bay is on the right. A warehouse is on the left. The laboratory complex sits behind the gatehouse. The new production building approved last September has not yet broken ground. Across the road, on a quiet residential street in one of the most ethnically diverse local government areas in Sydney, the people who run the lines drive home in their utes, speak Arabic in the kitchen, Vietnamese at the school gate, Greek on the phone to their mothers. The sign on the gate says Selleys. The address on the cartridge in their ute, for several of the most iconic product lines, says Australian made. The company that owns the trademark is registered in Tokyo. The family that controls the company is in Singapore. Lesson 1. A refugee can build it. A founder can sell it. A country cannot get it back. Martin Selleys arrived in 1939 with 10 Reichsmarks. He built an empire over 24 years. He sold it to British Paints in 1963 at 66 years old. The sale price has never been made public, not to the press, not to the workforce, not to history. From that moment, Selleys belonged to whoever the global paint industry was consolidating around. British Paints, Hoext, Isai, Orica, DuluxGroup, Nippon, 6 owners across 63 years. The country never had the option to buy it back, because the country never owned it after 1963. Lesson 2. 16.1 times is the price of Australian sovereignty. Nippon. Paint paid the highest EBITDA multiple in global paint M&A history. Because what they bought was not the factory, not the workforce, not the soil. They bought the brand on the cartridge. If it's Selleys, it works. That phrase, after 80 years of Australian use, is worth $4.2 billion to a Singapore-controlled Japanese-listed company. The factory at Padstow is a footnote. The brand is the asset. The country is the cost. Lesson 3. The soil underneath tells the truth. 40 years of chemical manufacturing leave a record the marketing department cannot rewrite. The Senversa Remediation Action Plan of October 2024 confirmed what the workers who breathed those solvents already knew. The empire was built on ground that has to be cleaned before the next empire can be built on top of it. Joanna Bakopanos signed the rebuild approval on the 30th of September 2025. The new factory will be Singapore-controlled and Japanese-listed. The soil it sits on will still be Australian. The workforce on the line will still be Australian, Lebanese, Vietnamese, Greek, Mandarin, Macedonian, Italian, Chinese, English. The man who paid for it all with 10 Reichsmarks is buried in the Jewish section of Northern Suburb Cemetery. He gave generously to the Montefiore Jewish home. He kept the sale price private. The yellow cartridge is still on the workbench. The orange nozzle. The smell of acetic acid in the bathroom on a Saturday morning. The label on the iconic lines still says Australian made. If it's Selleys, it works. The cartridge survives. The country that made it is somewhere else.